Hey guys, how you going? So welcome to chapter 12. In this chapter we're going to look at cell growth and differentiation, how the cell grows and differentiates during the development of an organism and what results from that. Okay. Now this chapter is kind of split into kind of multiple components, but I'm going to try and largely split into two components. We're going to one look at antenatal development, which is what happens prior to birth in an organism, and then we're also going to kind of wrap up the bits and pieces around stem cells, embryos, and cancer from the previous chapters. Okay, so let's jump into it. All right, cell growth and differentiation. Let's start with antenatal development. Antenatal development refers to that stage of development of an organism prior to birth. That is, the word antenatal means before birth. And so it is what is happening during that pregnancy stage. Now, for the purpose of this chapter, we are only going to focus on human antenatal development. But so you can sort of see that there are minor and major differences between humans and other mammals and things like that. So the starting point for antenatal development is fertilization, and the end point being the organism then being born, the baby actually being born. And that takes around about a period of about 40 weeks. From starting with the last menstruation of the female all the way to the fertilization, and then working its way towards a full term, which sits at about 40 weeks or approximately just a little bit shy of 9 months. Okay. Now, during the stage, three things will happen. One, the most obvious thing is that the baby grows through mitosis, and you can have from one cell to billions and billions of cells, up to 38 billion in just the forebrain of the baby alone. Okay. Not only is the baby growing during that stage, it is also differentiating. It is specializing. The cells are going from your one totipotent embryonic stem cell to your over 200 different types of cells that are now being developed inside the baby. Yeah? It was also then organizing those cells into tissues and organs, which will then serve their particular function once the baby is born. Okay, so that's the kind of the three main things that happen during this particular stage. Okay, let's rewind it a little bit and look sort of basically review what happens to the egg first, and then hopefully we'll move from there. Okay, so when females reach puberty, they begin maturing their eggs and release it every menstrual cycle. We sort of discussed this a little bit in the past about during that time. The egg, it's stored inside a fluid-filled sac called the follicle, and then it gets released by a particular hormone called the FSH, which is the follicle-stimulating hormone. Here's an image of what it looks like. And there's your follicle, and that's what stores the egg. Remember that females have a set number of eggs that, since birth, and those eggs are being released at the start of puberty. And so that follicle stimulating hormone causes the eggs to grow and then release from the follicle, and the egg then goes into from the ovaries into the fallopian tube. Now, from there, it needs to go out from the ovaries and in towards the fallopian tube, where it makes its way down towards the uterus. The follicle then becomes the corpus luteum, which continues to release estrogen, which promotes that kind of that growth and those hormonal changes inside the female during that period stage. Okay. And estrogen will also cause the lining of the uterus to thicken. It is preparing the female for pregnancy. So the uterus lining thickens for the sake of the egg, and there is this 12-hour fertilization window that the female has from the time in which the egg is released from. So there's the ovaries, and then the egg is released into the fallopian tube, and that process is called ovulation. And from there, it makes its way through the fallopian tube, and there's this 12-hour window around here that the female has to then get fertilized. Yeah, and then from there, it will start making its way down towards the uterus, where it will implant itself in the side of the uterus and then grow to become the baby. Okay. Now, if fertilization occurs, then that's what happens. The baby then starts to grow and develop. If fertilization doesn't occur, you have the period, which is the shedding of the uterus lining. All of that thickness of the uterus then has to be shed from the female, and so does that egg, and that's kind of what happens during that period. Okay. When the egg gets fertilized, you can see here's a bit of a diagram of an egg. You've got many sperm sort of making its way through the uterus and then into the fallopian tube, but only one gets accepted inside the egg, usually the first one that gets there. And the sperm that gets in will then incorporate its DNA with the egg to form a full diploid number of chromosomes in that particular egg. So now the egg is now fertilized and has a full diploid 2N number of chromosomes. Okay, just a side note there, that's your polar bodies that we were talking about during the meiosis phase. Yeah, the first and second polar bodies are sort of sitting there, but obviously they've lost majority of their nutrients and organelles, etc. Okay, now embryonic development. So from that fertilization, we now call that particular organism an embryo. It's formed after that first mitotic division and up to 8 weeks of development. From week 1 to week 8, it is called, on average, it is called the embryo. Yeah, and over the first couple of days, a few things will happen. The embryo then moves along the fallopian tube, makes its way to the uterus, continues to divide, and by the 5th day, it now forms what we call a blastocyst. Yeah, and it contains 2 particular segments: an inner cell mass and an outer cell mass. Yeah, so there's the embryo with only 4 cells. There's that embryo with 8 cells. And then as it continues to divide every time, 4 becomes 8, or so 1 becomes 2, 2 becomes 4, 4 becomes 8, 8, 16, 16, 32, 32, 64, 64, 128. Once it gets to about that stage, it will then split off and form 2 things: the inner cell mass and the outer cell mass. Yeah, the outer cell mass will form the placenta. Yeah, which is what connects the baby to the uterus of the mother and also the bloodstream of the mom, and provides all the nutrients and oxygen that the baby needs to survive. Okay, the inner cell mass is what makes up the rest of the embryo. Yeah, and so that little cell mass splits off into 2. The inner cell mass themselves will then go through the final embryonic development, which is called gastrulation. Yeah, gastrulation is a very complex process, but it basically is during that time the embryo begins to differentiate. It begins to form its different layers. It reorganizes itself into 3 main layers. Okay, we call that the ectoderm, which is the outer layer. Ecto, once again, ecto meaning outside, dermal meaning layer, mesoderm, which is middle, and then endoderm, which is the inner layer. Okay, and these germ layers are all stem cells, yeah, but they are pluripotent. In other words, they still have incredible capabilities of becoming any cell, but they are no longer totipotent, which means they can become any, because now you've split off and you've specialized into 3 particular layers. And from weeks 3 to 9, that is when you get the development of the major organ systems. Major organ systems being developed and structures. And it's also a critical time during the development, because at these times, this is also where you get your abnormalities occur, your birth defects. Okay. And also the embryo then starts to orientate itself from head to tail axes to the front and back axes. So it now becomes from just kind of a bit of a lump of gooey cells to now forming your individual. Okay, here's a diagram of what it looks like. It doesn't look like a baby at this stage. It kind of looks like just a mass of cells, connected to the side of the uterus. So that little pink, this pink thing is the uterus, and then there is your embryo, or your blastocyst, and then this is your different layers. Yeah. So the 3 cells, the 3 germ layers form different parts of the body. The ectoderm forms the skin. It also forms your brain, your spinal cords, and your nerves, and it also forms some of your glands. Yeah, your pituitary gland, your adrenal medulla, and also your eyes and inner ears. The mesoderm here will form the structural components in the body, the heart and the blood vessels. It will also form your skeleton and all of your cardiac muscles. Okay, it also forms bone marrows, bone cells, and also your lymphatic tissue. Okay, the endoderm, which is the inner layer, forms your internal organs. Yeah, all your main cavity organs like your lungs, your respiratory tract, your gastrointestinal tract, which is your stomach, your intestines, and things like that, and your liver. So all the organs that sit inside your body cavity are formed by the endoderm. And you can sort of see that the layers look nothing like a baby at the moment, but that's where the specialization will then happen. There is the yolk sac, that little yellow thing, which then supplies the nutrients to the individual, and you can see there that is the placenta connecting the baby to the mother. Okay. Now, it is also during the stage where the major development occurs, and also because of that, you can also get major birth defects occurring. Okay, and so we call these birth defects congenital abnormalities. Yeah, which is basically another word for birth defects, and Here is a bit of a diagram showing where all of the different development occurs. Yeah. So you can see there in your central nervous system, anywhere up to from about weeks 2 onwards, you can get problems there. Your heart forms at about week 3. Your upper limbs, week 4. Your eyes around about the 4th to the 5th weeks. And then lower limbs, teeth, and then you can sort of see there's a progression moving forward there. Yeah, the red indicates all the major malformations that occur, and then the yellow ones usually are the minor defects that occur. Okay, and so you can see there one of the most common ones, the cleft palate, occurs usually around about week 6 or 7, and this window is also the most common place because that's where basically all of those organs can realign. Sorry, not realign, can sort of align during the development, and it forms your defects. Yeah, cool. All right. From there, the embryo then changes. Yeah. So after 9 weeks, the baby now enters the fetal development stage. It's no longer called an embryo, but it is called a fetus. And it is characterized by the presence of all major organs. Yeah, so the embryo doesn't have all of its major organs yet, but developing them. Once it becomes a fetus, it has its major organs, but it's not fully developed. So basically, from there, weeks 9 to a full term, which is over 30 weeks in total, you've got some major growth, about 400 times the initial mass of the baby. Further development of the organs happen, and the baby just basically gets bigger. You can see there, the embryonic stage looks a little bit like that. By the fetal stage, you can see now it is recognizably a baby. Yeah, it looks like a baby. It contains all the major organs of a baby, and its heart, has already started to beat. Its brain has already released signals, and it's basically development. Yeah, and so there's a picture of a fetus there. You can tell that one there is a male, and that's basically the easiest way to tell. You look for that little extra appendage between the legs to indicate a male. It's also during this time usually they make mistakes and things like that as well. Okay, but that's sort of what it looks like. Okay, now fetal development really is just the time in which it gets bigger. Yeah, and so what happens is the female's body has to be pushed to their limits to really make space for this baby. Because if you think about the development, you're getting something that starts off as being barely 1 gram, all the way to something that weighs a whopping 3,600 grams on average, which is about 3.6 kilos, right? So it's like a watermelon inside the female. And you can see that the development growth there working its way through the weeks, week 4, week 8, kind of making its way through. You can see there's some kind of landmarks in terms of length. It reaches about 30 centimeters after 22 weeks, which is basically like having a bowling ball inside your stomach, and then it sort of makes its way through, getting bigger until eventually it is like having a watermelon growing inside the individual. And so that's the major pregnancy stage, and then at 40 weeks, the baby is born. Okay. Now let's look at abnormal embryonic development. So as I said before, abnormalities that occur during that stage is called congenital malformations. Yeah, basically another word for birth defects. Yeah, and there's a few reasons why this can occur. The first one is probably one of the biggest, is the genetic factor. Yeah, single gene and chromosomal factors will contribute to abnormalities occurring inside a baby. If a gene goes wrong during that division phase, it can result in an abnormal development of a particular part of the embryo, or perhaps even the whole embryo themselves. Cystic fibrosis is an autosomal recessive condition that will occur, and it is an abnormality that occurs in one of the genes, which results in issues around breathing, lungs, and mucus buildup around certain organs. Yeah. Here's just a diagram of what it looks like. The airways in particular are ones that are affected. The mucus lining kind of thickens too much and doesn't get removed, and individuals with cystic fibrosis will often have trouble breathing because of that mucus buildup in the lungs. Okay. Sickle cell anemia is also another genetic factor that occurs as well. So rather than having normal blood cells, they have what we call a sickle cell blood, which is kind of a bent sickle shape blood cell, and because it's bent and not round, it clogs the blood arteries, and as a result, individuals with sickle cell anemia will often struggle getting oxygen to their cells, and won't be able to do intense exercise and things like that. Okay. Other things also include dwarfism and Down syndrome are also congenital malformations which sort of arise from issues with the chromosomes in an individual. Yeah. Here's an image of a child that has Down syndrome, and you can see some of the characteristics there. We will talk about this in later chapters, but it's just good to sort of give you guys an indication of some of the things that can go wrong. Okay. Other things, second factors are what we call environmental factors. Okay, environmental factors are external things that can then contribute to malformations or birth defects in the baby. Yeah, we call those things tetratogens. Yeah, tetratogens, any sort of factor that results in a malformation, includes radiation, drugs, chemicals, disease, alcohol, smoking, and malnutrition. So all of these factors are things that can be controlled, but if they're not controlled well, will contribute to the malformation in an individual. Okay, so one particular case is the case of thalidomide. You would have looked at this perhaps maybe in your Year 10 science course, but thalidomide was a drug that was used as a morning after, to cure morning sickness, not morning after, to cure morning sickness, where the drug itself resulted in shortened or absent limbs in a few individuals. Yeah, so these were some of the cases that occurred in the 1900s, and basically individuals with this had birth defects to their limbs. Yeah, so they had really these kind of non-functional shortened arms that weren't working properly, or shortened legs. And fully developed brain and everything, but just suffered from these malformations in their limbs. Okay, mercury. Mercury, you can often sort of hear stories about how mercury can sort of affect child growth. Too much mercury also affects the development of babies as well. And there was a kind of a period of time where mothers were using mercury in things like makeup and things like that, and that kind of went into the bloodstream, goes through the placenta and into the child. And so methyl mercury was one of those things that really resulted in a big kind of outbreak in birth defects in Japan in particular, where they were using it. Basically, they were using it a lot, and as a result, there was a large proportion of babies born during that particular stage with these birth defects related to mercury poisoning. Okay. Cool. So that's that for embryonic development. Next week we're going to look, next lesson we're going to look at embryonic stem cells, cancer, and the like there. Okay, I'll catch you guys then.